This is Strategy of Abstraction in the Modern Website. I am Kevin Pittman, and I am with Georgia Tech, Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself so you can have a better understanding of where I'm coming from with the ideas I'm going to present today. So I started with the Ivan Allen College about almost a year ago exactly. Before that, I worked at Georgia Tech in their central IT unit for 16 years as a systems and web application administrator. Before that, I was a student at Georgia Tech. So I've been at Tech for over 20 years now. And at Tech, I got my computer science degree, and back then, I thought I was going to go into software development, but I got sidetracked over into IT support for those 16 years, and then finally realized, saw the light, that I need to be in development. So I got back into web development. I've been doing it on the side, but just not professionally. So when I started with Ivan Allen, it was a very interesting job to come into because I was the first person in this job. The college had never had a dedicated web developer before. They had a bunch of websites, but those sites had been just developed by anybody they could get to do it. So I inherited 30-something websites, and they had been made by faculty, by staff, by grad students, undergrad students, even a couple of small outside development companies. And as I started going through them, getting a sense of what they had and what I was going to be dealing with. Okay, this is great. And this is what I get for not testing this on, I don't know what resolution I got put into, but it's smaller than I thought it was going to be. So my navigation is all from my screen. These things happen. So there were a lot of recurring problems with these sites. Even amongst different developers, I was seeing some of the same problems coming up. There was no standardization. Well, that was mainly because there had been no one to work with these people and show them what standards should be used. But there was even sometimes no standards within a site. Like one person built half the site, another person built the other half, and they didn't really fit together at all. There was a lot of complexity in some of these sites. I started dubbing them Frankensites because it felt like Frankenstein's monster. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, cludge it together because somebody thought all these things should be in one site. There was too much functionality, too much data, thousands of data nodes for a small unit and no organization to them. There were these just terribly kludged landing pages. There was one site in particular that I spent over an hour trying to help the unit figure out how to change something on the front page because it had been so poorly kludged, none of us could figure out where it was coming from. It was on there. We knew it had to be somewhere. I ultimately had to dump the database and search through the entire file system, and I finally found out somebody had kludged that into a template file instead of using the features of the CMS to place that information. And along with those problems, we had no documentation. I couldn't find a single shred of documentation for any of these sites to tell me how they'd been built, why certain decisions had been made. Even internal self-documentation was virtually non-existent on the sites. A few had a little bit, but not much. And the back-end file systems. There's a lot of cases where they were very cluttered up with junk that should never have been there, things that should have been cleaned out before they went to production. It was a mess. So as I started rebuilding these sites and cleaning them up, I realized we needed a new way of thinking about website design. We needed a good standard philosophy. But I also wanted to see if I could figure out what the root of these problems were. And as I reviewed all these sites and I thought about it, and I looked at what I thought was driving how the sites had been built originally, I decided that I think too many of these developers were just hung up on the visual design. They, we're getting these requirements from the client, which would be one of our colleges or one of our project centers, one of our specialty units, and they didn't want to say no to anything. They wanted to please that client so much that they didn't speak up if they recognized something that was going to be a problem, or maybe sometimes they just didn't recognize the limitations of the system they were going to be building in, and they just said, yes, we'll do it. Yes, we'll take care of that. And then when they couldn't figure it out the right way, they just kludged it, made a mess of it, but got it to look right, because they were, so concerned about doing everything just like the client wanted. And I think that's a problem. I think that good website design starts with good customer service skills, talking with the client and being able to guide them to a good design instead of just saying yes to everything they ask you for. Because they don't always know what they really need. They may know what they want, but what they need is something different. And as a developer, you've got to help them see what they really need. But never say no. Just don't always say yes. You just find something in the middle, give them ideas they haven't thought about, and try to steer them to those ideas. Yeah. So I came up with this concept, this idea that, I try to tell people that visual and functional design, there are two components that have to work together in harmony. You can't let one drive the other and dictate what the other's going to do. So as you're thinking through the visual design of the site, you always need to be thinking about what's going to support that. What can you use within your content management system? In our case, we're all going to be thinking Drupal, right? So what can Drupal do, and what does it have trouble doing? What kinds of things is it going to require a lot of excess custom coding or modules that may not be up to par, and steer the client away from those ideas? And work up a visual design that you know that your CMS can support. Your visual design's just got to leverage the back end, but not overtax it. And the back end has to be architected to support the front end without a bunch of hacks, plain and simple. And this is something that I've seen not just in web design, but in other artistic fields. Outside of the IT world, I'm a professional puppeteer, and I design and build puppets. And if you think about, let's say, your favorite Muppet character, it is two components, just like a website. It's that visible skin, like think about Kermit the Frog. There's that visible skin that everybody sees, they virtually interact with, but then there's everything inside the puppet that gives it shape and form. And there's the features of the puppet that let the puppeteer animate it and bring it to life. If those aren't built right, that skin doesn't matter. The skin is useless without the structures to support it. And I've seen some cases where people built puppets that were not very usable. They looked beautiful, but you couldn't do a whole lot with them because they didn't think about the functionality. So with these ideas in mind, I have come up with what I call our philosophy of website design for the Ivan Allen College sites. And it's got 4 principles: the strategy of abstraction first design, the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages, the virtue of documenting your site, and the joy of streamlining your back-end systems. And what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about each one and how we're embracing that, how we're using this principle to make our new sites better. And I have, over the past year, rebuilt about a dozen of our sites. So these are things I put into practice. And I'll show you a few examples from our sites of how this works. So the strategy of abstraction first design. This may be something new to some of you. Some of you may have heard this kind of concept before. I don't know if this wording might be familiar. This is something I've come up with myself, leaning on my heavy programming background. In programming, abstraction is this idea that you take a component of a program and you bring it out into its own independent set of code that can work without the rest of the program having to know what's going on inside. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, abstraction is basically creating classes. You create a class, and what goes on in the class is that class's business and nobody else's. and the rest of the program interacts with it through public functions, but it doesn't know what data structures are in there. It doesn't know what private functions are in there. It just knows the interface to connect with it. So my thoughts here were, after seeing so many Franken sites with so much heavy functionality, too many things pushed into one site, I thought, why can't we abstract some of this into separate web systems that are each able to be maintained better on their own, and then integrate that back to the main site so that the main site can connect with them. The main site can be, even presenting some of that information itself, but not having to manage the information and not having to be basically bootstrapped for every single thing that's going on in your web. I call it the web ecosystem now, since we're talking about multiple applications. And I know a lot of us have probably had it hammered into us that CMSs are more and more the Swiss Army knives of the web. They can do everything. There's, thousands of Drupal modules out there. You could probably say that whatever you want to do, there's a module for that. But a wise person said to me once, it's better to do a few things well than a lot of things poorly. Or, in even simpler terms, quality before quantity. So I think the best way to really lay this out is with examples. So here's the first example that's probably the easiest for anybody to grasp. Lots of sites have photo albums. And traditionally, it's been commonplace to want to build the photo album into the main CMS some way. And there are modules in Drupal to do that. The problem is, it's not usually very easy to get that working. It's usually some level of custom coding, custom styling, putting in several different modules in there to get everything to work. And then you have a very proprietary sort of system. So you then have to work out custom ways to import any existing photos into the site. And if you ever move from that site to something else, now you got to come up with a custom way to get all those photo albums out of that site to the next big CMS, whether it's going from, say, Drupal 6 to 7 or 7 to 8, or even coming into Drupal from something else, or Drupal out to something else like WordPress. So there's systems out there totally designed to handle photo galleries. And my thinking is, why build something in Drupal if you can leverage a system that already does everything you need to do for photo galleries and make it look like it's part of your Drupal site? Just integrate it back in. And so since we had a college that had about 200 photos in I think about half a dozen albums, I took a look at how I could make that work better and faster. And something I had used before was a system called Gallery. And it's a free and open source photo gallery system. It has a lot of good features, pretty easy to get going. Unfortunately, I discovered it's gone on hiatus. The developers for it are no longer supporting it. But there's a fork that is supported called ZenPhoto. And ZenPhoto has everything Gallery had and then some. So I took a copy of ZenPhoto and started playing with it. And in just half an afternoon, I was able to wrap it in our Georgia Tech theme, which we're using on the main Drupal site. So everything above this line, everything below this line is our Georgia Tech theme. And ZenPhoto just renders in the middle of it. And when you're on the main website, you see those same elements looking exactly the same. So that gave us the look and feel. ZenPhoto I was able to install in a subdirectory of Drupal, so the URL paths look like it's all part of the main Drupal site. The other elements that come up that people will always kind of bring up and sometimes tend to be roadblocks are, well, we want the navigation to match. And we don't want to have to do it twice, once in the outside system and once in the main website. I added a handful of lines of code and extracted the menu structure from the Drupal database and had it inserted here so that whenever they change the menu in Drupal, it changes on this page as well, and all of the other ZenPhoto pages. The same with our Facebook icons. That way they can maintain all of the core elements in Drupal and not have to duplicate their efforts to make sure that the ZenPhoto pages match. The other thing that comes up as a roadblock is, they'll say, we don't want to have to remember multiple accounts and usernames to manage everything. Well, at Georgia Tech, we already use the Central Authentication Service, or CAS. And CAS is a great tool for getting all of your sites to use the same accounts and the same usernames. And even if you don't have a CAS server already, or your client doesn't have a CAS server already, Drupal's CAS module can act as a server. So you can either set up your main site to manage accounts for everything else, or you could build a standalone Drupal site to be their CAS server without them having to set up the JSIG CAS software, which is Java-based and takes more effort to get going. So there's ways to provide them with central accounts. Now, I'll admit, ZenPhoto happened to be one of these somewhat major web apps that didn't have a CAS module, but it had a module API, and in the other half of that same afternoon that I built the theme, I ported some CAS code to work in ZenPhoto. So it didn't take long at all to get all this integration working. It wasn't a roadblock at all. Another area where we had a lot of complexity on our existing websites was faculty profiles. And faculty profiles are kind of different from standard user profiles. If you're not from the land of academia, a faculty profile is basically a picture of their entire academic history. And traditionally, this was provided in a document they call curricula vitae, but now more and more they're putting this up on a website because it's easier for people to see. And so you're talking about the list of all the degrees they've gotten, their certifications, the courses they've taught, the projects they've worked on, the publications they've produced, and a lot of that's collaborative, so you have lots of multi-to-multi relationships going on there. You know, a lot more complexity than just a typical basic, here I am, user profile, name, address, phone number, and you're done. For us, we had another complexity in that we have 6 schools within the Ivan Allen College, and about 5 or 6 project centers, and so some of our faculty do have appointments in multiple areas. And they had ended up basically with 3 or 4 redundant profiles, one in each area that they work in. And of course, they were never being updated simultaneously, so they were always out of date. So I looked at all this and said, how can we, A, make these sites easier to work with? Because every site had its own set of functionality for creating and editing profiles, and none of them were alike. And every site had local data. So I created a central profile server. One place to go to edit your profile or create a new one, and that server provides the data to all of the websites. And so I got all of that working, imported data from all the sites, and then since we're moving every site that we can to Drupal, I created one Drupal module that integrates back to the main website, provides virtual pages where you can see lists of faculty, select their name, and see the profile for that person. And all that data is being pulled dynamically from the central server when it's needed, instead of being stored in the main website. And that way they always see a visitor always sees the latest updates. So there's a number of benefits to this, to abstracting out functionality, setting up a series of web applications instead of one giant Frankensite. And one of them is resources. I took one of our sites and did some numbers on it because we had one site that was in Drupal 6. So I could compare apples to apples going from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7. Many of our other sites were in either a custom CMS or something like WordPress. This particular college level or school level Drupal site in Drupal 6 had 1,000 data nodes because it had all those faculty profiles for the school. It had local news articles and current events, many of which went back 4, 5, 6 years because there was no mechanism to clean that stuff out. So they post things on a weekly basis, but nobody ever got rid of the old stuff that was out of date. And so after extracting all of that, and setting up the central profile server, and then getting a new module in place to connect with our Georgia Tech Central News and Events server so that they could post things there and they'd just be pulled down dynamically like those faculty profiles. I got the site down to just 85 nodes, and I got it down to 26 core modules, which is eliminating about 70 modules, I think, that were in use on the old site. Now, not all of those were related to the profiles, but there was a good number related to profiles, news and events feeds, and some other things that we abstracted. So this new site, much smaller footprint. It runs much faster because when Drupal bootstraps and is doing other functionalities, it's not dealing with all those extra modules, all those extra data nodes. And it's much easier for the school to maintain. And from what I've heard, they're pretty happy with it. There's some other benefits too. When you separate things out, you get better security, at least in my opinion. This is one of the things that can always be argued, but from my point of view, I think you get better security because with separate systems, you have much finer grained control over what users can access. So if you've got, let's say, your main website, a photo gallery site, a profile site, let's say maybe you have a discussion board site. Each one of those you can control at the site level who has access, and not have to create a user account for somebody who doesn't need to be part of that. So your main website with your core content, the only people who need to be on there are the ones who update the core content. People like, say, discussion users, they're only on the discussion board site. And you may say, well, is that a big deal? Well, how many times have you seen Drupal vulnerabilities come up? They come up a lot. We wish they didn't, but they do. And if that vulnerability is particularly, usable by someone with a user account, and you've got 1,000 discussion board users on your main website, suddenly any one of those people could use that vulnerability until you get it patched and do something bad to your main website. If the only people on your main website are just the core editors, it's much more secure. You also have fewer internal dependencies. Think about the number of modules I mentioned. If you have 96 modules to get everything working in one site, every time you need to do an update, you got to check all those dependencies, test a lot of things before you push out the new version. If you've only got 25 modules, a lot faster to test those dependencies, make sure it works, and push it out. Yes, you have 2 or 3 or 4 sites to patch, but I still think it's easier to patch a site with a smaller footprint than to patch a giant site. You also have more uptime. If you got that ecosystem with the main site and 3 other sites, you can patch the smaller ones individually without taking down the main site. One giant Franken site, every time you need to patch, you got to put it in maintenance mode and everything's offline at once until you finish patching. So now, with the ecosystem, you can patch photo albums and not disturb anything else, and only have to patch the main site when it needs a specific patch that relates to it. And I think one of the more important things to think about here is major upgrades. We're in this era now where we're getting ready to start thinking about moving our sites to Drupal 8 in the next couple of years. And if you haven't looked at Drupal 8 yet, it's got a lot of changes. And it's got a lot of changes in the module APIs. I got a feeling there's going to be a lot of modules that do not make it to Drupal 8. If you've got 96 modules that you're trying to sift through and figure out how to make all that functionality work in Drupal 8, it's going to take you a long time. If you're building simple sites and you only have to focus on 25 modules, you're going to be able to get that site to Drupal 8 a lot faster and a lot easier. So, with that, let me go on quickly now into the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages. And again, these are some things we've been doing to try to make our pages much easier for people to maintain. There may be other ways of doing this, but this is certainly working for us, and it's far better than what we had in the past. So the first thing I try to do, and I try to tell my fellow workers to do, is follow the flow of a CMS and follow the flow of your selected theme. And if you're getting requests from the client and you're looking at it and going, well, the only way I can implement this is to hack core, or the only way I can implement this is to hack the theme they told us to select in some weird way that's not standard, that's a red flag warning sign that you need to rethink what's going on. And maybe you need to go back to the client and talk with them about what they're asking for. And try to convince them to go with a flow that doesn't require hacks. Because today's hack will always end up being tomorrow's massive headache. Always. It may not be your headache, but it can probably come back to be yours if you're not careful. So it's really about being gently honest with the client and guiding them to those decisions that are going to be feasible. I start by, completely eliminating anything that looks like eye candy, bells, and whistles. If the client's asking for things that have no necessary purpose, I try to steer them clearly away from that. Keep it simple, because every extra function you put on there is something that takes time, something that may have to be patched, something that could cause problems down the road. So, if it doesn't need to be there, why implement it? Why waste the time? And then, of course, as I mentioned before, never put content directly into the template files. That's just a terrible no-no. If you can't find any other way of doing it, you got the wrong design. You got to go back to the beginning and think about your design again, think about the CMS and the theme. And of course, in some cases, you may be building the theme. If so, that's great. Build it to work with what the client needs, but use the standards of Drupal. Don't, hack an existing theme in weird ways that nobody else will understand. And if you can't figure out any way, again, other than hacking, then you're probably going at it the wrong way. So in Drupal specifically, I've worked up some techniques for getting our landing pages to be very smooth. And the first tip I give is always assume that your visual block orderings are going to change. So go ahead and spend the time building each block out as a Drupal block. Don't take shortcuts. Don't say, oh, these three areas are going to be side by side. I'll make one block and stick everything in there. The shortcut you take now will be wasted time later when the client changes their mind and says, I want this news up here, or I want the logos down here. So just assume it's going to change. Make everything movable. And as you're building those blocks out, always work with good CSS practices of set a standard style for all of your blocks. Go up and set it on the block element so that everything gets standard margins, standard padding, standard borders, and then override as needed. That way, when you are having to move these around, or when you go make this responsive, which we should all really be doing now. I've heard like over half of usage of the web now is on mobile devices, maybe even more than half. So we should be making responsive designs, and that means we've got to be able to shift around as the screen size gets smaller. So start with those standards and then make changes as necessary. Something I find incredibly useful is I always use the node block module. And that lets me take a node and turn it into a block. So this is a node that's been turned into a block. And that gives you all the power of Drupal's node system, in particular being able to use the attachment field to attach files. So this image is attached to this node, and it will always be there with it. If you just make this out of a custom block from a block organizer, you don't get to attach files. So you have to stick those files somewhere else. And wherever you stick them, someone's going to probably not realize what they are. There's a chance that someone else cleaning up the site will delete those images, and suddenly there's no images on your front page. But this also means that you can set this up where your content editor can edit the nodes without having to be able to edit the block layout, because the node is powering the block. So they can have the power to change this content wherever they need to without having the power to accidentally mess up the entire block layout. One of the most useful things that I've been doing, and I've been getting lots of good feedback on this, is I try to make sure every block has a usable contextual menu with an edit link. And the contextual menu is the little cogwheel that you'll see when you're logged in and you have editing rights and have contextual menus turned on. It's in the upper right-hand corner. And if that block is providing something contextual, then you'll have those customized options as a menu when you click on the cogwheel. So no block automatically provides this. And if you made a custom block in the block organizer, it provides it too. But if you're writing custom modules to make some of your blocks, there won't be anything there unless you program it in. And it's not the most straightforward thing. I had to do a bit of research to figure out how to create my own, but I took the time to do that. And so on a layout page like this, or landing page, I was able to set every one of these up. So every one of them has some kind of an edit link when you hover over it. And that edit link takes you to the source of the data. So there's no searching and hunting, trying to figure out what provides the data for a particular block, even if it's not in the site. I can provide a link to an external site somewhere, such as on these, the link would take the person to the Georgia Tech News and Events server. So the content people don't have to keep a bunch of bookmarks or a bunch of notes by their desk. They just log in, go to the landing page, find the right edit link, click, and they can edit that content. Saves a lot of time and a lot of headaches. Now, if you want to know how to do that, I just don't have time to do all the technical here, but I have a post at the resources page for my presentation that gives you all the technical details about how to do contextual links in your custom modules. And I'll share that link again at the end of the presentation. So now, the virtue of documenting your site. Why should you document? Trust me, you will forget. You may think you're going to remember how you built that site, how everything worked. Trust me, after 2 or 3 months, you're going to completely forget. And if the client comes back and wants changes, you're going to be stumbling around trying to remember how you put everything together. And you may have other people who are going to help maintain the site. The client may have their own people who are going to maintain the site. They should be able to know how everything works. So it's heavily beneficial to create documentation. And I think the best way of going about documenting a site is what I call self-documenting designs. It can be hard to ever sit down and write out regular, documents about how the site works, but you can put documentation into Drupal. So as an example, looking at this block organizer, the way to self-document is by giving clearly descriptive titles to every object that you create that tells exactly what it's for and what it's doing. So you look at something like this, front page : welcome block. That tells me immediately this is on the front page and it's the welcome block that's got the welcome message for that site. This is the part that's really helpful and important because in Drupal 7 at least, the block organizer doesn't tell you where anything comes from. You just got this list of titles from everything that generates a block. Now Drupal 8 does make it better. I'm looking forward to that. Drupal 8 shows you something about the category of the source. But in 7 and 6, you're just looking at a bunch of titles. You can't tell like menus. Every menu I create, I put menu : in front of it. Now when I glance down this, I can see all the menus immediately. I don't have to read into the subtitle. I don't have to dig into the settings to figure out it's a menu. I can just quickly glance at this and tell what's what. So it takes a few extra seconds to prefix everything, to write out easily readable titles, but it's worth it. And if you're asking and saying, well, maybe I don't want that displayed on the page where that block renders. Well, the Drupal block organizer will let you override that for the display. So go ahead and set usable titles that make sense and are easy to understand by anybody, and then override them where necessary if you need something simpler on the screen. And whatever you do, try to avoid something really, really arcanely simple like about. I see people creating pages, they just title it about. About what? It's not even grammatically correct. About's a preposition. It needs an object. At least say about us, about the center, about the unit. And it's not just because it's grammatically correct. It helps everybody. It helps anybody maintaining the content to tell what is what, especially if they need to go through the documents, the pages, and see what's going on and weed out old ones. And accessibility. Whether you have to do accessibility or not, you ought to be. And for somebody who's hearing these things read aloud, the more information you give them to help them know what page they just went to, the easier it will be for them to know if they found what they're after or not. About tells them nothing, but about the center at least gives them a clue that something about what's going on that page. And then the other tip, something I've been trying to do a lot of is, if there's things that need extra documentation, I put it right in the site. Make a content type that only administrators can edit and see, and then just make pages with your documentation. That way it's in the site, it's always going to be there no matter what happens, it can't get lost, but it can still be locked down to just the site administrators. That's far better than no documentation, or documentation that gets stuck somewhere that future developers have no idea where it went. Yes?
So, your suggestion there is to do a separate content type and have it refer back to certain sections. I've been doing some pages where in the content type, some of the fields are private and restricted to specific users.
That's a great idea.
Do you see any pitfalls in doing that? In other words, it's on the page that it's referring to. It's just in a place where only administrators can see it or something like that. Or in a field that can only be...
I mean, that sounds like a good idea. If you're using something that allows you to set permissions on the fields, you could have a comments field on a content type that is admin only or content editor only, where they can write out comments that won't be displayed to the public, but all the content editors can see them.
I was assuming that it couldn't be seen, but you always want...
You have to test that. That's the key thing, is whenever you implement something like that, you want to test it carefully in development and make sure it really does stay hidden. And in any of these things inside the site, I would never put sensitive information. Obviously don't put passwords or other things that you wouldn't want someone to see. Those should be in a separate location that's off the web. But there's a lot of things you could document that it wouldn't matter so much if they got found, but it would be very helpful with someone maintaining the site. So finally, we have the joy of streamlining your back-end systems. And maybe it's just me because I come from a systems administration background, but there is a joy when I can end up with a system that's all neatly organized on the back end and I can actually find everything without hunting. Wonderful. So I think a lot of times what can happen is that, you go out and build a site, you get close to the deadline, and you say you're going to clean it up before you push it to production, but you never find the time to do it because the deadline hits, the deadline gets pushed up. So I say start organized from the beginning. Develop an organizational scheme and stick with it, and then you don't have to clean up at the end. And there's various ways of approaching this. If you're migrating or upgrading a site, what I like to do with it is, if it's a site where I'm going to just build a new one, where I'm not going to have to later do an in-place upgrade because of the nature of the content, I just clone the site, clean the clone up, and work with it. I take out everything that doesn't need to be there. And it's not just cleaning out the pages, the nodes. You should look through everything. Clean out your taxonomies if there's things there that shouldn't be there. Clean out old user accounts of people who no longer work with the organization. Clean out old modules and themes. Get it as stripped down as you can to start with. I think it's easiest to do that at the very beginning rather than later on because you're going to be fresh on the project. Your mind's going to hopefully be a little clearer because you're not under the deadline stress. And if you did remove something that the client wants, you got that entire development period for them to notice. Whereas if you remove something towards the end, they may not notice till it's gone to production and they'll be much less happy. Even if you can get it back. But my golden rule of thumb, I don't install anything into my development sites until I know I need it. And this is in contrast to one developer who I'll keep nameless, but developed a couple of our sites. And their idea of development was install Drupal with their development space and install literally 200-something modules, and then enable the ones they thought they might need. Now, you can argue whether that's helpful or not, but the worst thing was that never got cleaned up. So the site got pushed to production with 200-something modules in the directories. And that's a mess. And when you have any number of extra modules or other add-ons that you don't need, not only is it messy, but it could be insecure, and it can slow down your site. So keeping it clean, more secure is faster. And one of the reasons it's more secure is that any module could have vulnerabilities. And let's say somebody found a hack into your site. If you've got a bunch of extra modules here that you haven't been looking at because they're not turned on, and one of them has an old vulnerability, somebody turns it on, you might find the first way they got in and patch it. They might know now how to get in through that other module and do something. You never know. But if you don't have anything on there but the ones you're actually using, that limits the number of backdoors they can find. And as far as speed, something to be aware of that I didn't know about until we had a bad incident occur. There's this function in Drupal called Drupal get path. And whenever a module needs to find an include file, let's say a CSS, JavaScript, extra PHP code, it uses Drupal get path to get the location of where that module is installed. Well, Drupal get path does a recursive tree search down all 3 module trees, core modules, sites all modules, and sites default modules. And if you've got hundreds upon hundreds of modules, that is a lot of directories that it is going through every time it needs to find a new path. It does cache some of that information, but the information eventually expires from the cache. We had a situation where one of our web hosting servers got a degraded file system. And all of the sites but 2 continued to run reasonably well, and those 2 Drupal sites got excruciatingly slow. They happen to be the 2 sites built by that developer who left hundreds of extra modules in the module directory. And when I did a search of my own, I found there was about 5,500 files it was having to scan through every time it needed to find a path. And on a degraded file system, that's slow. So I started cleaning out everything I could, and it was amazing. After we got rid of about 120 of those modules, the site was usable again. Just because Drupal get path can take up that much time on a degraded file system. Hopefully you don't get a degraded file system, but it can happen now and then. And until it gets fixed, it's good to have a streamlined site that can keep going. The other thing I try to do is have a standard organization for all my add-on components. Because I've had some of these previous developers who, they decide we're going to make a directory called custom under sites all modules, and then another one called contrib. And if you actually put things where they make sense, that's okay, but then they didn't put them, all the modules into one of those directories. Some went here, some went there. They just didn't organize them at all. Now you're hunting everywhere when you need to patch a module. You don't know where it's installed. And worst of all, that's not very conducive to doing automated updates. So my strategy, my standard is all the modules go in sites all modules directly, no subdirectories. And that way I can use an automated script to update everything, because the script doesn't have to find them. It just goes to that one directory and does the replacement. Other possibilities are certainly acceptable. I just say stick with it. Don't change mid-pace and have some modules here and there, because a lot of modules you can't move them once they're installed. If you're installing, for example, a field module, once you start using it, you can't turn it off, and you can't move it because there's a lot of internal pointers that point to where it is now. So you're stuck with it where it is, whether it makes sense or not. I also strongly recommend use the libraries module. That lets you pull all of the library files into a separate libraries tree. And then if you ever have those problems with Drupal get path and a degraded file system, at least it's not scanning all the hundreds of files that are in some of these libraries. It's only scanning the actual module files. And there are some modules that require libraries. They won't run without it, but even if you don't have one of those, I still say install it because it can let you move libraries for other modules that don't require it and relocate them. And then utilities and content. If you got anything to support your site, don't put it in the web root if it doesn't need to be there. I've found some cases where people install scripts and such that are really only going to be run when you're logged in, like say through SSH. They should be in a private directory, not where they can be seen by over the web. That not only keeps it cleaner, but again, there's just no reason to have things in the shared web root that don't need to be accessed from the web. And if you are keeping your archive files, for example, for the modules you're installing, again, keep them outside of the web root. Just set up one private folder somewhere. A lot of web hosts give you that anyway, but if not, make one. And keep everything away from the web root so that web root's as clean and streamlined as possible. And then the last thing I highly recommend is don't put content files right in the file system. In other words, don't upload directly to your web host, files that the client wants shared. Create pages within Drupal and attach those files so that they can be attached maybe in groups that make sense for what they are. If there's an existing page, put them on the existing page that they fit with. If there's nothing that they really fit with, make a catch-all page. But in any way you look at it, you're associating the files with some kind of a subject, that tells you what they're about. And you're letting Drupal store them in its standard location. And so they're not in, willy-nilly places all throughout the Drupal installation. Because that's what happens when people start uploading files to the file system. They pick their own path, their own locations, and you get a mess. And that makes it hard when you need to do a core upgrade of Drupal, since you've got to replace all those core components and you're working around everything that somebody else uploaded directly to the system. Now, you may get the complaint, well, we want these URL paths to keep working. That shouldn't be a roadblock. You can always use htaccess redirects. They're not that hard to set up, and that will redirect the old path to where you put the file. I know you can't, I'm almost certain you can't use URL aliases to point to a file in Drupal. I'm almost certain they can only point to a node or other official page. There might be some module out there. I keep meaning to go look to see if there's a module that will let you add arbitrary redirects, but there's going to be a way to do it, and htaccess always works. I mean, if you can upload Drupal, you can modify your htaccess. And that'll take care of the paths. So that is a very, almost feels rushed, summary of my philosophy in website design, the strategy of abstraction first design, separating your functionalities into multiple web applications instead of one gigantic Franken-site, the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages, organizing your pages so they can be reorganized, blocks can be moved around and everything can be edited without hunting and searching. The virtue of doing documentation and ways of documenting that don't have to be quite so painful. And the joy of streamlining your back-end systems, how to do an organizational scheme from the beginning and keep things clean and neat so that you can find stuff later. Are there any questions? Yes?
Keeping with the idea of abstraction, and you mentioned that you had a little contextual edit link that allowed content providers to go and update content without having to wade through all of a lot of site structure. Was that something that they accessed within the Drupal framework, or did you build pages like almost portals into the site or other places where they could insert the content there that would just go directly into Drupal without them having to log in and,
With our sites, they would log into Drupal.
Okay.
And they would have a content editor account with permissions to edit local content, and I make sure they have access to use contextual links, and so that those would show up for them. Any other questions? Yes.
With the file that you were mentioning earlier about not uploading the files directly, have you encountered any problems with files that you have to update every once in a while? So like PDFs, for example, some policy that gets updated, so you want to replace it so that there's no there aren't any people accessing the old file basically when you upload a new file, a replacement file for it. I know you mentioned like redirects and stuff like that, but I don't know if there's any other alternatives. Because what we normally do is we don't attach it, we upload it directly, and then we replace it with a revised one. So I don't know if there's any shortcuts or anything like that to dealing with documents like that.
Well, usually it's easier to update them when they've been uploaded because you can just delete the old one and upload the new one. I'm not sure what your group is doing.
About attachments, having them like on a, so basically on the page or the directory itself, you're saying delete the attachment and put up another one, an updated one?
Right.
Okay.
I mean, one of the keys to Drupal, because Drupal likes to automatically rename attachments if you've uploaded something with the same name as an existing one, delete the current attachment, save the page, edit again, and upload the new one, and that'll let you upload it with the exact same name. So it's a little goofy, but that technique does work really well. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your Drupal camp experience.